If you enjoy real, disturbing stories like these, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with someone who loves late-night horror. And before we begin, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And let me know, have you ever experienced something you still can't explain? Turn off the lights. Lock your doors. Let's begin. The hardest part about living completely alone isn't the silence. It's when the silence is broken by a sound that shouldn't be there, like the sound of someone breathing from the other side of a locked door. This happened to me 3 years ago, during the middle of January. I was 24, flat broke, and desperately needing a job that would pay enough to clear my student debt. I found a listing on a local community board for a winter caretaker position. The job was simple: look after a massive 3-story Victorian home in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. The owners were older, wealthy couple who wintered in Florida. They just needed someone to keep the pipes from freezing, clear the snow, and make sure the property stayed secure. The pay was incredible, almost suspiciously high. But I didn't care. I needed the money. The closest town was a 40-minute drive down a winding, heavily wooded 2-lane road. The nearest neighbor was at least 5 miles away. When the owners handed me the keys, they gave me one specific instruction: keep the basement door locked. The foundation is old, and drafts come up from down there. It seemed like a normal request. I didn't think twice about it. The first 2 weeks were incredibly peaceful. I spent my days reading, chopping firewood, and watching the snow pile up outside. The house was beautiful, but it had that heavy, settling feeling old houses get. The floorboards creaked, the wind howled through the chimneys. But it wasn't until the 3rd week that the isolation started to feel less like a vacation and more like a trap. It started on a Tuesday morning. We had gotten about 6 inches of fresh snow the night before. I made my coffee, walked into the living room, and looked out the massive bay windows toward the front yard. That's when I noticed the footprints. A single set of deep, heavy boot prints in the fresh snow. My heart did a slow, nervous flutter. Out here, nobody just stops by. You have to intentionally drive up a 2-mile private dirt road just to reach the driveway. I looked down the driveway, expecting to see tire tracks, but there were no tire tracks. The driveway was completely undisturbed white snow, which meant whoever made these footprints hadn't driven here. They had walked through miles of frozen woods. I set my coffee down and walked to the front door, making sure the deadbolt was secured. Then I followed the footprints with my eyes through the window, and that's when the real dread set in. The footprints didn't come from the woods toward the house. They came from the side of the house, walked out into the yard, circled around the giant oak tree, and then came right up to the living room window, right where I was standing. The person had stood outside in the freezing cold, looking into the living room. Then the tracks moved down the porch and stopped at the guest bedroom. Then the kitchen window. They had walked around the entire perimeter of the house, looking in every single room on the first floor. I immediately grabbed my phone and dialed the local sheriff's department. It took them over an hour to arrive. A single deputy walked the property with me. He noted the footprints, but by the time we got to the back of the house, the tracks disappeared onto the driveway where the wind had blown the snow away. Probably just a drifter or a hunter who got turned around. Keep your doors locked. Call us if they come back. He left, and I was alone again. I spent the rest of that day obsessively checking every window latch and every door. By the time the sun started to set, throwing long, skeletal shadows across the property, I was a nervous wreck. I decided to sleep in the master bedroom on the 2nd floor. It felt safer up there. I double-checked the heavy deadbolt on the front door. I checked the back door. Finally, I walked down the long hallway toward the kitchen to check the basement door. I froze. The deadbolt on the basement door was unlocked. I stared at the thick brass latch. I distinctly remember locking it my very first day here. The owners had specifically told me to keep it locked. I had no reason to ever open it. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly, and pushed the latch back into the locked position. The metal click echoed loudly in the empty hallway. I stood there for a long time, listening. The house was dead quiet. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had forgotten to lock it. Maybe the vibration of the old house had slowly nudged the deadbolt loose. I was trying to convince myself I wasn't in danger. That was my biggest mistake. I went upstairs, locked the master bedroom door, and got into bed. I left a small bedside lamp on. I couldn't sleep. Every time the house settled, I jumped. Around 2:25 a.m., the bedside lamp flickered and died. The entire house lost power. I lay there in the pitch black, my eyes wide open. My first thought was the snowstorm. Power outages happen out here all the time, but there was no storm tonight. The wind was completely still. And then I heard it. Downstairs, in the kitchen, the slow, deliberate squeak of a floorboard. Someone was inside the house. My blood ran ice cold, the kind of cold that paralyzes your muscles. I couldn't breathe. I just listened. Creak, creak, heavy, slow footsteps moving from the kitchen into the main hallway. They weren't rushing. They were moving with the casual confidence of someone who knows the layout of the house perfectly in the dark. I slid out of bed silently, my bare feet hitting the cold hardwood. I grabbed my phone. No service. The storm the week before had knocked out the closest cell tower, and without the house Wi-Fi, my phone was just a glowing piece of glass. The footsteps reached the bottom of the main stairs. Thump. A boot stepped on the first wooden stair. Thump. The second stair. They were coming up. Panic took over. I looked frantically around the pitch-black bedroom. I couldn't go out the window. It was a 20-foot drop onto frozen ground. The only place to go was the walk-in closet. I moved as quickly and quietly as humanly possible, slipping into the large closet and pulling the louvered doors shut behind me. I wedged myself into the furthest corner, hiding behind a row of winter coats. I pulled my knees to my chest and clamped a hand over my own mouth to muffle my breathing. Thump, thump. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They paused. For a terrifying 30 seconds, there was absolute silence. I imagined this person standing at the end of the hallway, staring in the dark, listening for me. Then the footsteps moved directly toward the bedroom. They stopped right outside the bedroom door. I watched through the tiny slits of the closet door. The bedroom door handle began to jiggle, slowly at first, then more aggressively. Rattle, rattle, rattle. They knew I was in there. Suddenly, a massive, deafening crash echoed through the room. They had kicked the door. The heavy oak frame splintered, but the lock held. Crash! A second kick. The door flew open, slamming against the drywall. A tall, wide silhouette stepped into the bedroom. I couldn't see a face, just the outline of a heavy winter coat and something long and metallic gripped in their right hand. A crowbar. The figure stood in the center of the room. They didn't turn on a flashlight. They didn't need one. I watched, holding my breath until my lungs burned as the figure slowly walked over to the bed. They raised the crowbar high into the air and brought it down violently into the mattress, over and over, ripping the blankets, tearing the sheets. If I had stayed in that bed, I would be dead. After a minute of violent swinging, the figure stopped. They stood over the ruined bed, breathing heavily. Then they slowly turned their head toward the closet. My heart stopped. Did they hear me? Did I shift my weight? The figure took a slow step toward the closet doors, then another. They were 5 feet away, 3 feet away. I closed my eyes, bracing for the doors to be ripped open. But suddenly, outside the house, a blinding red and blue light flashed through the bedroom windows. The sound of a police siren blared in the driveway. The deputy from earlier had returned to do a late-night perimeter check. The figure froze. They looked toward the window, then turned and sprinted out of the bedroom, heavy boots thundering down the hallway. I didn't move. I stayed huddled in that closet for 20 minutes until I heard the deputy shouting my name from the bottom of the stairs. When I finally came out, shaking uncontrollably, the police searched the entire house. The intruder was gone. They had slipped out the back door and disappeared into the tree line. But it was what the police found during their search that still gives me nightmares to this day. They went down to the basement to check the breaker box, which the intruder had manually switched off. But while they were down there, they found something tucked away in the deepest, darkest corner of the cellar, behind the old furnace. A sleeping bag, food wrappers, several empty water bottles, and a collection of Polaroid photos. The intruder hadn't broken into the house that night. The footprints outside from earlier that week, they weren't from someone trying to figure out how to get in. They were from someone who had walked out the side door to stretch their legs and was looking through the windows to keep an eye on me. The police determined the man had been living in the basement since before I even arrived for the winter. For 3 weeks, I had been living alone in that massive, isolated house. But I was never actually alone. He was down there, listening to my every move, waiting for the right night to come upstairs. After that night, I didn't think anything could scare me again. I thought that was the absolute peak of human terror, until I heard what happened to the next person. You don't realize how deafening the sound of your own heartbeat is until your car engine completely dies on a road where no one else has driven for days. This happened to me in the late fall of 2019. I was 26, moving from a crowded apartment in Austin, Texas, to a new job in Phoenix, Arizona. I was driving a heavily packed Honda Civic, my entire life shoved into the trunk in the back seat. I've always loved driving at night. There's no traffic, the air is cool, and you can just cruise. But out west, the darkness hits differently. It's not just an absence of light. It's a heavy, suffocating void that presses against your windows. It was around 1:30 a.m. when my GPS chimed. There was a massive multi-vehicle accident on Interstate 10, completely shutting down westbound traffic for miles. The app rerouted me onto a state highway and eventually onto a desolate stretch called County Road 191. It was a poorly paved 2-lane road cutting straight through the desert scrubland. No streetlights, no gas stations, no reflective markers on the asphalt. Just my headlights cutting a small tunnel through the pitch black. I had been on this detour for about 40 minutes when I noticed the first strange thing. Up ahead, sitting on the dirt shoulder of the road, was a vehicle. It was an old, beaten-up utility van. Its headlights were off, but its hazard lights were blinking in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Blink, blink, blink. As I got closer, I slowed down slightly, hovering around 40 miles per hour. Standard highway etiquette says you at least check to see if someone needs help, but as my headlights washed over the side of the van, a deep, primal instinct told me to keep my foot on the gas. The van's sliding side door was wide open. There was no one in the driver's seat, no one standing outside changing a tire. Just a gaping black hole leading into the back of the van. I sped up, passing it quickly. I checked my rearview mirror, watching the blinking hazard lights fade into the distance.
I convinced myself it was just an abandoned, broken-down vehicle. 10 minutes later, I checked my rearview mirror again. About a quarter-mile behind me, a pair of headlights had appeared. At first, I felt a wave of relief. It's nice having someone else on a dark, creepy road. But that relief evaporated almost instantly. The headlights were moving fast, much faster than I was. Within a minute, the vehicle was riding my bumper. They were so close I couldn't even see their headlights in my rearview mirror anymore, just the massive dark grille of a large truck or van filling my back window. I tapped my brakes lightly, just enough to flash my brake lights, sending a polite back-off signal. They didn't back off. I sped up to 65. The truck sped up to match me. I dropped my speed to 40. The truck slammed on its brakes, matching my speed exactly, still riding inches from my bumper. My mouth went completely dry. I was out of cell phone range. The indicator on my dash showed 0 bars, no service, no houses, no exits. I decided to let them pass. I put my right blinker on, slowed down to 20 miles per hour, and pulled half my car onto the dirt shoulder. The vehicle behind me pulled over onto the shoulder too, and stopped. We were both sitting there in the dead of night, my car idling, their engine rumbling violently behind me. I stared into my side mirror, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The headlights behind me were blinding, completely obscuring the windshield of the vehicle. I waited for someone to get out. Nobody did. They were just sitting there, waiting to see what I would do. Panic started clawing at my throat. I slammed the car back into drive, yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, and floored the accelerator. The Civic's engine roared as I hit 70, then 80 miles per hour. I looked in the mirror. The headlights were still there, staying perfectly in sync with my speed. But then, they did something that still makes my stomach drop whenever I think about it. The vehicle behind me turned its headlights off. I was going 85 miles per hour on an unlit desert road, and the truck following me had just plunged itself into total darkness. I couldn't see them in the rearview mirror. I couldn't see them in the side mirrors, but I could hear them. The heavy, roaring engine was still right behind me. The only time I could catch a glimpse of them was when I tapped my brakes. The red glow of my taillights would briefly illuminate the massive, rusted grille of that same utility van from earlier, the one with the sliding door wide open. They had been waiting for someone to drive by. Tears were streaming down my face now. I was hyperventilating, desperately trying to keep the car straight on the winding road. And then things got infinitely worse. My headlights caught something in the middle of the road about 200 yards ahead. It was a line of orange traffic cones stretched horizontally across both lanes, and parked horizontally behind those cones was a heavy-duty pickup truck, completely blocking the path forward. It was a barricade. I slammed on my brakes. The anti-lock brakes shuddered violently as the tires screamed against the pavement. My car fishtailed, coming to a dead stop about 30 feet away from the cones. Dust plumed into the air, glowing in my headlights. I threw the car into reverse, snapping my head back to look out the rear window. The dark utility van had stopped exactly 50 feet behind me. They had boxed me in. I was trapped in the middle of the desert. The engine of my Civic idled, sounding pathetically weak compared to the heavy, menacing rumble of the van behind me and the truck ahead. Through the dust, I saw the driver's side door of the pickup truck open. A man stepped out. He was huge, wearing a dark, heavy jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't run towards me. He just started walking, slowly, methodically, kicking the orange cones out of his way. Then I heard the sound of gravel crunching behind me. I looked in my side mirror. 2 more men had stepped out of the dark utility van. They were walking toward the back of my car, and one of them was dragging something metallic across the asphalt. Sparks flew up as it scraped the road. A heavy chain. They were going to drag me out of the car. I locked the doors. It felt pointless. My mind was racing, calculating impossible odds. The man in front of me was now 15 feet away. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a heavy steel flashlight, raising it up to smash my windshield. I didn't think. Instinct took the wheel. I shifted the car into drive, yanked the steering wheel hard to the right, and floored the accelerator. The Civic's engine yelped as I jumped the curb, plunging off the paved road and violently into the rugged desert brush. Crunch! The undercarriage of my car smashed against rocks and heavy roots. The vehicle bounced so hard my head slammed against the roof. I was driving blindly into the desert, my tires spinning and violently tearing through the dry earth. I heard a loud metallic thwack against my trunk. One of the men had swung the chain as I passed. I kept the gas pedal pinned to the floor. I swerved around a massive cactus, the side of my car scraping aggressively against the thick thorns, tearing the paint. I drove completely off-road for about 200 yards, the suspension screaming, before I aggressively jerked the wheel left, forcing the car back up the embankment and onto the pavement on the other side of the blockade. I didn't look back. I drove at over 100 miles per hour for the next 20 minutes, expecting a tire to blow out at any second. My steering wheel was vibrating violently, and the car was pulling hard to the left, but I didn't care. Eventually, the dark road broke into a faint orange glow, a small highway town. I pulled into a brightly lit 24-hour truck stop, drove right up to the front doors, and laid on the horn until the cashier came running out. I called the state troopers. They took an hour to arrive. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold the cup of coffee the cashier gave me. When the troopers finally went out to County Road 191 to investigate, they didn't find the truck, they didn't find the van, but they did find the traffic cones. And hidden in the brush, just off the shoulder where the van had originally been parked, the troopers found something else. 4 shallow, empty holes dug in the desert dirt. Freshly dug, about 6 feet long each. The trooper who took my statement looked at me with a grim, pale expression. He told me I was the luckiest person he'd ever met in his 20 years on the force. Because those men weren't looking to rob anyone. You don't dig graves before you rob a car. You dig them when you know the driver is never coming back. By the way, if you've made it this far, comment the word awake below. I'm curious how many of you are still listening to this in the dark. And if you are, don't look behind you. Let's continue.
The most terrifying thing about security cameras isn't what they catch on tape. It's what happens when you realize someone knows exactly how to trick them. This happened to me 2 years ago, right after I bought my first house in a quiet, dead-end cul-de-sac in suburban Ohio. It was the kind of neighborhood where people left their garage doors open during the day and kids rode their bikes in the street. I lived alone, working as a freelance graphic designer. My schedule was completely backwards. I'd sleep during the day and work late into the night. To feel a little safer, I installed a high-end smart doorbell camera. It sent a notification to my phone anytime someone stepped onto my front porch. For the first 6 months, it only ever captured the mail carrier or neighborhood stray cats. Then, the house directly across the street was sold. The new neighbor was a tall, incredibly gaunt man who looked to be in his late 50s. He drove a dark gray sedan and never seemed to leave the house during daylight hours. The first red flag wasn't his appearance, it was his windows. The day after he moved in, I watched him from my home office window. He was taping heavy black contractor garbage bags over every single window of his house. Not just the bedrooms, The living room, the kitchen, the garage windows, total blackout. I brushed it off. Maybe he worked night shifts too and needed to sleep during the day. But a week later, the motion notifications started. It was a Tuesday night at 3:15 a.m. when my phone lit up. Motion detected at front door. I opened the app expecting to see a raccoon digging through my trash. The live feed loaded. The porch was completely empty. The street lamp illuminated my driveway, and there was nothing there. No wind, no animals. I figured it was a glitch. I went back to work. The next night, at exactly 3:15 a.m., my phone lit up again. Motion detected at front door. Once again, I opened the app. Once again, the porch was completely empty. This happened for 4 nights in a row, exactly at 3:15 a.m. On the 5th night, I decided to pull up the recorded footage instead of just looking at the live feed. I wanted to see what was triggering the sensor right before the notification popped up. I scrubbed the video back to 3:14 a.m. The footage was completely normal, empty porch. Then the clock hit 3:15 a.m. The video didn't show a person walking up. It just shifted. It was a subtle jump cut. 1 second, the shadow of my porch railing was cast across the concrete. The next second, the shadow was gone. I stared at the screen, my brow furrowed. I watched the live feed. The timestamp in the corner was ticking away, 3:16:01, 3:16:02, but everything else in the frame was completely frozen. I had a potted fern on the porch. There was a gentle breeze outside, and I could hear the wind rattling my window panes. But on the live feed, the fern's leaves were perfectly unnaturally still. My stomach dropped. I realized what I was looking at. I wasn't looking at a live feed of my porch. I was looking at a high-resolution photograph of my empty porch held directly over the camera lens. Someone was standing right outside my front door, right now. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. I didn't turn on any lights. I slowly pushed my desk chair back and crept out of my office, walking silently down the hallway toward the front door. The house was dead quiet. The only sound was my own jagged breathing. I reached the front door. I didn't make a sound. I didn't even touch the wood. I just leaned forward and pressed my right eye against the glass peephole. It was dark outside, but the street lamp provided just enough amber light to see. Standing on my welcome mat, inches away from the other side of the door, was my new neighbor. He was holding a glossy printed photograph of my porch directly over the doorbell camera with his left hand. But his face was pressed completely flat against the wood of my door, positioned directly below the peephole. He was listening to see if I was coming. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. I was so close to him, separated by 2 inches of solid wood. Then, through the heavy oak door, I heard him whisper. It wasn't a general mumble. He was whispering directly into the crack of the doorframe. "I can hear you breathing in there." Tears immediately pricked my eyes. Complete paralyzing terror washed over me. I backed away from the door, my socks sliding silently on the hardwood floor. I watched the brass door handle. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the handle began to turn downward. Click. It hit the lock mechanism. I had deadbolted it hours ago. The handle slowly rotated back up. I retreated all the way into the kitchen and grabbed my phone to dial 911. My fingers were shaking so badly I almost dropped the device. As the operator answered, I whispered my address, begging them to send someone quietly. While I was on the phone, the motion notification on my screen vanished. The live feed returned to normal. The photograph had been removed. The porch was empty. He was gone. Or so I thought. "Ma'am, officers are on the way," the dispatcher whispered back. "Are you in a safe room?" "I'm in the kitchen. He left the front porch. I think he went back across the street. Okay, stay on the line with me. Do not turn on any lights. I stood in the dark kitchen staring at the front door down the hall, and then I heard a sound that made my blood run entirely cold. It didn't come from the front of the house. It came from the backyard. My kitchen has a sliding glass door that leads out to a small fenced-in patio. The vertical blinds were pulled shut, but they weren't entirely flush. There was a tiny quarter-inch gap between two of the slats. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound of fingernails dragging lightly against the exterior glass. He hadn't gone back across the street. He had walked around my house. I backed myself into the corner of the kitchen, clutching a heavy kitchen knife in one hand and my phone in the other. He's at the back door. I sobbed quietly into the phone. He's in my backyard. Through the tiny gap in the vertical blinds, I saw a shadow block out the moonlight. Then the handle of the sliding glass door jiggled violently. He wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. He was shoving his shoulder against the glass, trying to force it off the tracks. Bang! 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 The glass rattled in its frame. I screamed, gripping the knife so hard my hand cramped. Suddenly, a massive flood of light illuminated my driveway and the front of my house. The screech of police tires echoed down the cul-de-sac. 2 cruisers had arrived, completely dark until the last second, and flipped their spotlights on. The banging at the back door instantly stopped. I heard the heavy thud of boots running across my wooden patio, followed by the sound of my wooden fence violently shaking as someone vaulted over it. The police breached my backyard 30 seconds later with flashlights drawn, but they were too late. The alleyway behind my house led into a dense patch of woods, and he had vanished into the trees. They kicked down the door of the house across the street. It was completely empty. There was no furniture, no clothes in the closets, no food in the fridge. The only thing inside the entire house was found in the living room directly behind the blacked-out window that faced my house. There was a high-powered telescope on a tripod aimed perfectly at my home office window, and taped to the walls were dozens of printed photographs. There were pictures of my porch, pictures of my car, but the most disturbing photos weren't taken from the outside. There were 3 photos taken from inside my house, one of my kitchen, one of my hallway, and one of me asleep on my couch. The police realized he hadn't just been watching me from across the street. He had been sneaking into my house through an unlocked basement window for weeks, learning my schedule, memorizing my layout, and taking photos. The printed picture of the empty porch he used to trick the camera he had taken from inside my own house, looking out the front window so the lighting would match perfectly. They never caught him. The car in his driveway was stolen, and the name on the lease was fake. I sold the house to a property investor 3 days later at a massive loss. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted out. To this day, I check every single window lock before I go to sleep, and if my security camera ever glitches, I never, ever look through the peephole. There is a distinct feeling of terror when your sanctuary is violated. But what do you do when the terror doesn't come from a person? What happens when you encounter something on a dark road that defies all human logic? Let's find out. There is a very specific sound that a frozen lake makes in the dead of winter. It's a deep, echoing groan, a hollow boom that vibrates right through the soles of your boots as the ice expands and shifts. You get used to it after a while. You tell yourself it's just nature settling. But what you never get used to is the sound of the ice cracking under the weight of something walking directly toward you in the pitch black. This happened in late January of 2021. I was up in northern Minnesota near the Canadian border, staying on a massive body of water called Lake of the Woods. In the winter, The lake freezes so thick that people drive full-size pickup trucks miles out onto the ice and set up temporary wooden cabins called ice shacks for fishing. I'm a freelance photographer, and I had rented a remote shack for 3 days to shoot a time-lapse project of the aurora borealis. My shack was incredibly isolated. The closest neighboring cabin was at least 3 miles away. It was basically a wooden box on skis, equipped with a small propane heater, a cot, and a generator outside for power. The first day was beautifully quiet. The temperature dropped to -15 degrees Fahrenheit by nightfall, the kind of cold that physically hurts your lungs when you breathe. I set my camera up on a tripod outside, ran a cable back inside the shack, and sat by the tiny heater, reading a book. Around 11:30 p.m., the wind started to pick up, howling across the flat expanse of the frozen lake. And then the generator sputtered and died. The single overhead bulb in the shack flicked off. The hum of the engine was replaced by the deafening howl of the wind. I cursed under my breath. I assumed the extreme cold had thickened the fuel or caused a line to freeze. I grabbed my heavy parka, slipped on my insulated gloves, and grabbed my heavy-duty flashlight. I pushed the wooden door open. The wind immediately blasted snow into my face. I walked around to the back of the shack where the generator was chained to the skid. I shined my light on it. The fuel line hadn't frozen. It had been cleanly severed, cut in half. I stared at the thick rubber hose. The cut was perfectly straight, which meant it was done with a sharp blade. My stomach plummeted. I instantly swept my flashlight beam out across the barren, frozen lake. The snow was blowing horizontally in the wind. The beam cut through the whiteout for about 50 feet before being swallowed by the darkness. There was absolutely nothing out there. No snowmobiles, no trucks, no lights. Just endless, frozen blackness. I backed away from the generator, my breathing turning rapid and shallow. I hurried back to the front door of the shack. As I reached for the handle, my flashlight beam caught something on the ice just below the wooden step. It was a footprint. But it wasn't a heavy winter boot print. It was the imprint of a bare human foot. The toes were perfectly defined, melted slightly into the top layer of frost before instantly refreezing. It was -15 degrees outside. Whoever made that print should be dead from exposure in minutes. I shoved the door open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut, throwing the heavy iron deadbolt into place. I stood in the pitch-black cabin, completely paralyzed by fear. The only light came from the faint moonlight filtering through the single tiny window above the cot. I held my breath, listening. Over the howling wind, I strained to hear any movement outside. Nothing. I slowly walked over to the tiny frosted window. The glass was coated in a thick layer of frost on the inside. I raised my hand, used my thumb to melt a small circle in the frost, and pressed my eye against the cold glass. I looked out into the blizzard. At first, I only saw the swirling snow, but then, about 30 feet away, standing just at the edge of my vision, I saw it. A figure. It was a man, but he was wearing absolutely no winter gear. He was dressed in what looked like dirty, torn hospital scrubs. His arms were hanging limply at his sides. He was standing perfectly still, with his back facing my cabin, staring out into the empty, frozen wasteland. My mind couldn't process what I was looking at. A man in thin clothing, barefoot, standing in a deadly blizzard. He wasn't shivering, he wasn't moving to keep warm. He was just standing there like a statue. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. No service, not even a blip. I looked back through the peephole. He was gone. The spot where he had been standing was completely empty. A fresh wave of adrenaline hit me. Where did he go? Did he walk away, or was he moving toward the shack?
Then the shack violently jolted. Bang! Something heavy slammed against the side of the wooden wall right next to my head. I stumbled backward, tripping over my camera bag and falling hard on the wooden floor. Scrape, scrape. I heard the sound of nails dragging slowly across the exterior wood, moving from the side of the shack toward the front door. He was walking around the perimeter. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing the heavy metal ice auger, a drill used to cut through the ice, gripping it like a baseball bat. The dragging sound stopped right outside the front door. I stared at the brass knob. Slowly, the knob began to turn. It rotated to the right, hitting the lock mechanism. Then it violently jerked back and forth. Rattle, rattle, rattle. Someone was frantically trying to force the door open. "I have a weapon!" I screamed, my voice cracking with pure terror. "Get away from the door!" The rattling stopped instantly. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was absolute silence. Then a voice spoke from the other side of the wood. It didn't yell over the wind. It spoke in a calm, conversational tone, pressing its face right against the crack of the doorframe. "It's so cold out here." The voice didn't sound distressed. It sounded completely detached, flat, emotionless. "Let me in to get warm." "I've called the police," I lied, stepping closer to the door, my grip on the heavy iron auger tightening. The voice outside didn't respond. Instead, I heard the heavy, wet sound of a bare foot stepping onto the wooden porch, then a slow, methodical scraping sound. He was walking back toward the side window, the same window I had just looked out of. I didn't want to look. Every survival instinct in my body screamed at me to hide under the cot, but I needed to know where he was. I crept over to the tiny frosted window. I peered through the small hole I had melted in the ice. He wasn't standing 30 feet away anymore. He was standing inches from the glass. His face was pressed directly against the other side of the window, staring right into my eye. His skin was gray, mottled with severe frostbite. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and entirely black in the darkness. And he was smiling. I screamed, falling backward just as his fist smashed violently through the glass. The window shattered inward, blasting shards of ice and glass across the small cabin. The freezing wind immediately rushed inside, howling like a banshee. A pale, bloodied arm reached through the broken window, feeling blindly around the wall, searching for the door latch. I didn't hesitate. I dropped the auger, grabbed my truck keys from the table, and unlocked the heavy deadbolt on the front door. I burst out into the freezing blizzard. The wind immediately cut through my clothes. My truck was parked about 20 feet away. I hit the unlock button on my fob. The headlights flashed on, illuminating the blowing snow. I sprinted toward the driver's side door. As I grabbed the handle, I looked back at the shack. In the red glow of my taillights, I saw the man crawling completely out of the broken window. He hit the ice on his hands and knees. He didn't stand up. He turned his head, locked eyes with me, and began sprinting across the ice toward my truck on all fours, moving like an animal, moving incredibly fast. I threw open the door, dove into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut just as something heavy slammed against the side of the truck bed. I jammed the key into the ignition, desperately turning it. The cold engine whined, struggling to turn over. Whir, whir, whir. "Come on," I screamed, slamming my palm against the steering wheel. A pale, frost-bitten hand slapped flat against my driver's side window. The man pulled himself up, pressing his grotesque, smiling face against the glass. He opened his mouth, leaving a smear of freezing blood on the window pane. The engine roared to life. I threw the truck into drive and floored the accelerator. The heavy, studded tires spun wildly on the ice before finally catching traction. The man was thrown backward as the truck violently lunged forward. I didn't let up the gas. I drove at 70 miles an hour blindly across the frozen lake, following my GPS coordinates back to the mainland. I didn't stop until I reached the local sheriff's substation at 3 a.m. When a team of officers rode snowmobiles out to the shack the next morning, they found it completely destroyed. The door had been ripped off its hinges. The inside was covered in snow. They didn't find the man, but they did find out how he survived the cold. Tucked underneath the wooden floorboards of my rented ice shack, they found a small, insulated crawl space. Inside it was a massive pile of stolen heavy winter coats, sleeping bags, and survival gear. And wrapped inside one of those sleeping bags were 4 different driver's licenses, all belonging to ice fishermen who had gone missing on that exact lake over the past 5 years. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a monster. He was a predator, living under the ice, waiting for the perfect winter storm to trap his next victim. When you live through something like that, the fear never really leaves you. You carry it. You find yourself double-checking your locks, looking over your shoulder. But the most terrifying encounters aren't the ones where you see the danger coming. The worst ones are when you realize the danger has been sitting right next to you the entire time. Let's get to our final story. There is a false sense of security that comes with driving alone at night. You lock your doors, you turn up the radio, and you feel like you're inside an impenetrable metal fortress. But you don't truly understand how vulnerable you are until you look in your rearview mirror and realize you aren't the only one inside that fortress. This happened to me in the late fall of 2018. I was 23, driving back to my apartment in Seattle after visiting my parents in rural Oregon. It was a straight 7-hour drive up Interstate 5, but I had left my parents' house much later than I intended. By the time I hit the heavily wooded, desolate stretch of highway near the Siskiyou Pass, it was almost 1 a.m. It was pouring rain, the kind of torrential, blinding downpour where your windshield wipers can barely keep up, and the asphalt completely swallows the light from your headlamps. I was driving a mid-sized SUV. I had my heater blasted on high, a podcast playing through the speakers, and a large black coffee in the cup holder. I was tired, but I just wanted to get home. About 2 hours into the mountains, I realized I needed gas. I took an exit for a small, unincorporated logging town. The gas station was a dilapidated single-pump stop with flickering fluorescent lights buzzing under a rusted metal canopy. There were no other cars around. The attendant was a teenager, asleep behind bulletproof glass. I pumped my gas, shivering in the freezing rain. When it was done, I realized I desperately needed to use the restroom. I jogged around to the side of the building, found the peeling wooden door for the men's room, and went inside. I was gone for maybe 3 minutes. When I came back out, my car was sitting exactly where I left it. I hopped into the driver's seat, grateful for the lingering heat from the vents, and pulled back out onto the dark, empty highway. That was my first and almost fatal mistake. I had left the car doors unlocked while I was in the restroom. For the first 30 minutes back on the road, everything felt completely normal. The rain was still coming down in sheets. I was sipping my coffee, completely zoned out, watching the white lines dash past my tires. But then I noticed the windows. It was freezing outside, and I had the heater running on, so a little condensation on the glass was normal. But the windows were fogging up much faster than they should have been. There was too much moisture in the cabin. I turned the defrost dial up, wiping the inside of the driver's side window with my sleeve. As I did, a smell hit me. It was faint at first, masked by the scent of my coffee. But as the hot air circulated through the SUV, the smell grew stronger. It smelled like stale cigarette smoke, wet dirt, and something metallic, like old copper. I didn't smoke. My car was meticulously clean. I furrowed my eyebrows, leaning forward slightly, sniffing the air. I thought maybe I had stepped in something at the gas station, or maybe the scent was just drifting in from the outside vents. I tried to ignore it. 10 minutes later, I hit a slight bump in the road. From the back seat of my SUV, I heard a sound. Crinkle. It was the distinct sound of a plastic grocery bag shifting. My heart did a strange, uncomfortable flutter in my chest. I had packed all my luggage in the trunk. I didn't have any plastic bags in the back seat. I reached up and muted the podcast. The silence inside the car was instantly deafening, save for the rhythmic thwack, thwack, thwack of the windshield wipers. I kept my eyes glued to the dark road ahead, but I strained my ears, listening to the back of the car. For a full minute, there was nothing. I exhaled, feeling stupid. I told myself it was just a loose piece of trash under the seat, or maybe a water bottle rolling across the floorboards. I tried to turn the radio back on, and then I heard the breathing. It was a slow, heavy, rattling exhale. It was coming from directly behind my seat. A spike of pure, unadulterated adrenaline shot through my veins. My hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I slowly, agonizingly shifted my eyes up into the rearview mirror. It was pitch black in the back seat. I couldn't see anything. The tint on my rear windows made it impossible to see if there was a silhouette. I told my brain to be rational. You're tired. You're hallucinating audio. It's just the sound of the tires on the wet pavement. I needed to prove to myself that I was alone. I waited until a semi-truck appeared in the oncoming lane, heading towards me. Its high beams were blazing through the rain. As the truck approached, its headlights swept across the interior of my car for a fraction of a second. I stared into the rearview mirror. In that brief flash of white light, I didn't see an empty back seat. I saw a pair of massive, mud-caked work boots. They were sticking out from underneath the passenger seat. Someone was lying completely flat on the floorboards in the back seat, tucked behind the driver's seat. My stomach completely inverted. A cold sweat instantly broke out across my forehead. A man was inside my car. He had slipped into the unlocked back door while I was in the restroom at that isolated gas station. He'd been lying there in the dark, in total silence, for almost 45 minutes. My mind began to race at 1,000,000 miles an hour. I was going 70 miles per hour on a winding mountainous highway. There was a steep drop-off on my right side and a solid rock wall on my left. I was at least 30 miles away from the next town. I had no cell service. If I slammed on the brakes and tried to run, I was in the middle of a freezing storm with no shelter, and he could easily overpower me. If I pulled over to the shoulder, I would be handing him total control of the situation. I realized with terrifying clarity that my only advantage was that he didn't know I had seen him. I had to pretend everything was normal. I unmuted the radio, letting a soft pop song fill the terrifying silence. I forced myself to hum along, even though my throat was completely tight. I was hyperventilating, taking short, shallow breaths through my nose so he wouldn't hear me panicking. I drove like that for another agonizing 15 minutes. Every second felt like an hour. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I expected to see a hand reaching up from the floorboards. Then, the situation escalated. I felt a slight pressure against the back of my driver's seat. He was shifting his weight. He was getting ready to move. Through the rearview mirror, even in the darkness, I could see a dark mass slowly rising from the floor. He was sitting up on the back bench. I kept my eyes locked on the road, tears streaming down my face. I was completely trapped. I saw his silhouette in the mirror. He was a massive, broad-shouldered man wearing a dark, soaking wet hoodie. He didn't say a word. He just sat there, inches behind me, staring at the back of my head. I waited for the knife. I waited for the hands around my throat. But he didn't attack. Not yet. He leaned forward slowly until his face was hovering right beside my right ear. I could smell his rancid breath. I could feel the heat radiating off his body. "Take the next exit," a deep, raspy voice whispered. My blood froze.
I looked at the glowing green highway sign approaching in the rain. Exit 42, Forest Service Road. It wasn't a town. It was a dirt logging road that led deep into the absolute middle of nowhere. If I took that exit, I was never going to be seen again. I need to get gas," I stammered, my voice trembling so violently I barely sounded human. "Take the exit," the man repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifying, authoritative growl. I saw his right hand move in the darkness. He was holding something metallic. A glint of steel caught the faint light of the dashboard. I was a mile away from the exit. I had 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether I lived or died. I looked at the speedometer. I was going 65. I looked ahead. About a quarter mile past the Forest Service exit, I saw the bright, blinding sodium lights of an interstate way station. There were 2 heavy-duty state trooper SUVs parked under the awning, their reflective decals shining in the rain. I made my choice. I put my right blinker on, pretending to slow down for the dark wooded exit. The man in the back seat leaned back slightly, satisfied that I was complying. I drifted into the right lane. The exit ramp was coming up fast, but right as I reached the edge of the ramp, I didn't turn. I gripped the steering wheel with everything I had, slammed my foot entirely to the floor, and violently jerked the wheel back into the main highway lane. The SUV's engine roared as we shot past the dark exit at 80 miles per hour. "What are you doing?" the man roared from the back seat. He lunged forward, grabbing my right shoulder with a crushing grip, raising the metal object in his other hand. I didn't try to fight him off. I aimed my car directly at the brilliantly lit way station ahead. I laid my hand on the horn, letting out a continuous blaring scream. I didn't hit the brakes. I drove my SUV straight into the way station parking lot at 70 miles per hour. I aimed the car toward a row of heavy plastic water barricades set up near the inspection bay. "Hold on!" I screamed. I slammed on the brakes at the absolute last second. The anti-lock brakes violently stuttered. The SUV skidded across the wet asphalt, spinning sideways. We smashed into the heavy water barricades with a deafening crunch. The airbags instantly deployed, punching me in the face with the force of a heavyweight boxer. The cabin filled with white smoke and the harsh smell of gunpowder from the airbag deployment. The impact violently threw the man in the back seat forward. Because he wasn't wearing a seatbelt, he slammed head first into the back of my seat and the center console. I was dizzy, my ears ringing violently, but the adrenaline overrode the pain. I punched the seatbelt release, kicked my driver's side door open, and threw myself out onto the wet pavement. I scrambled to my feet, screaming at the top of my lungs, "He's in the car! He's in the car!" 3 state troopers came sprinting out of the way station office, flashlights drawn, hands on their holsters. They surrounded my wrecked SUV, shouting commands. I collapsed against the side of a concrete pillar, clutching my ribs, watching them approach the vehicle. One of the troopers yanked the back door open, shining his incredibly bright flashlight inside. He kept his gun aimed, but he didn't shoot. After a few seconds, the trooper lowered his weapon and looked back at me. "The back is empty," he yelled over the rain. I couldn't believe it. I ran over to the car. The back seat was completely empty. The opposite side door was swung wide open. In the chaos of the crash, the man had managed to open the door, stumble out into the rain, and disappear into the dense tree line bordering the highway. They brought out canine units and searched the woods for 6 hours. They never found him. The rain washed away any tracks he might have left. But they did find the metallic object he was holding when he lunged at me. It had fallen onto the floorboards during the crash. It wasn't a knife. It was a pair of heavy industrial bolt cutters.
The police told me that based on the items they found in the pockets of a wet jacket he left behind in the trunk, zip ties, duct tape, and heavy contractor bags, he wasn't looking for a ride. He was hunting. And if I had taken that exit into the woods, no one would ever have found my car. I survived that night, but my life hasn't been the same since. To this day, I refuse to drive alone at night, and even in broad daylight, before I get into my car, I always check the back seat, because you never truly know who is waiting for you in the dark. And that brings us to the end of tonight's stories. Have you ever been alone in your house or out on a dark road and felt that sudden sinking realization that you were being watched? Have you ever checked your locks only to find one already open? Let me know your own strange and unexplained experiences in the comments below. I read each and every one of them. If these stories kept you awake, please make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It helps the channel grow and tells the algorithm to share these late-night terrors with others. Share this video with a friend who loves the thrill of a good scare. Thank you for listening. Until next time, keep your doors locked, check your back seat, and stay safe in the dark.